Yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about Mieko Kawakami's Heaven novel. I read this a couple months ago and I placed probably, I think, 20 ish, maybe 25 little tabs while I was reading just for me to go back to. And some of them are quite small, maybe observations. The other ones, maybe more important, centralized to the actual theme. But I wanted to go through and talk about them. So I start on page 12. I have the Europa edition. It's very beautiful. Um, but on page 12, I'll start at the front of the paragraph because my tab is on that last half. But it says, among the trash, I could make out all these dry clumps of dog or cat crap. The way the sand stuck to them, they almost looked like tempura. I tried to count the individual nuggets, but new ones kept popping up. The whole sandbox was probably full of them. Then it hit me. Whoever called me here might force me to eat them. The back of my throat burned. I emptied my lungs in an attempt to make the taste of the crap go away, but the thought alone made me sick. And I really like this because it shows one of the central themes very early on about this what I want to call PTSD, right? Like this child has been bullied relentlessly to the point where he was called out seemingly in a friendly manner, and the instant he sees something as silly as animal feces on the ground, he's already formulating how this is going to be used against him. And I think that was a great addition to this early on. You know, it does more for me than, say, I think a little bit later uh, in this chapter in which he just simply talks about how he's bullied, right? Like that really shows to me that he's constantly thinking about it, and I really liked that. My second one is not too far off on page 17. Um, I'll read the small paragraph. This is when the main bully, Ninomiya, uh, and some of his friends are messing with him. And he says, whether they were kicking or punching or pushing me, Ninomiya and his friends were careful not to ever leave a mark. When I got home and saw I had no bruises, I always wondered where they could have learned this kind of trick. And this says a lot, right? Because as much as he constantly, as much as the main character constantly, or I guess the male main character constantly talks about how he's not going to talk to people about it. You know, he's pretty adamant on not snitching or not asking for help. He's still kind of looking for these things, right? Like he's looking to see if he has bruises, how he's going to hide that, or perhaps how he would prove that he's being bullied. I don't believe he says, but the idea that you know, and this is a big part of this book that you know makes it clear that it was written by an adult, is that this is such a link to think about when you're looking after getting like jumped effectively. You know, where did they learn this kind of trick, right? I know as a child, if something bad happened to me, I'm not thinking of the person who did it to me first. So whether it was the bullying or his his eyes that have caused him to grow this type of consideration, or at least you know, I guess consideration isn't necessarily positive, but this consideration for others, for it to pop into his head at all is very interesting. So I really liked that part. My next is on page 21. This one's a quick one. It's during the letter that I don't think it's the first. Oh no, it was the first letter that he'd responded, or the first time he responded to the letter to Kojima. And at some point, he said, "My house is just like what you said about your house. So boring. It's funny, but when I'm doing nothing, I get this feeling like I'm fighting something. Stuck. Fighting. It never goes away. Even when I'm in bed, even when I'm walking around. There's a year and a half left of middle school, but if everything goes smoothly, we have 3 more years of high school after that. We'll be doing the same thing for years. Don't you think that's weird? I do." And this is just a quick one that I liked, where he feels like he's stuck. I think most people can kind of understand or empathize a little bit with having some kind of quandary that you're thinking about and not quite knowing how to proceed or not knowing what to think about it, and it just sticks with you, right? Whether it's anxiety or like a physical problem that's occurring or something like that. I think that was a very relatable statement where you just feel like you're fighting something constantly. You can't relax. It really shows his mental state. It's one of the early parts of the book that really tells you how much he's suffering on a daily basis, not just when being bullied. On page 23, during a bullying session, he talks about being inside of a locker for the first time. And I'll just read these few sentences. This wasn't my first time inside a locker. I was no stranger to the dust-clogged air and muted darkness. Whenever this sort of thing happened, I just started counting in my head, not thinking about anything else. When I got to 100, I went back to 1 and started over. I never asked myself how many hundreds I had counted or how much time had passed. I tried not to think anything or feel anything or let my mind wander. And this it's not a particularly large one. This is a coping mechanism that he's developed in order to get through these stressful times. And it's a different type of stressful, right? Getting jumped or something is way different than being stuffed inside a locker in a claustrophobic space and kind of just waiting until you can get out, right? Like, I think they told him not to go anywhere or something, so he waited until, if I remember correctly, he had to use the bathroom, right? And he didn't want to pee on himself. So, it's a coping mechanism that luckily he's developed for himself, to kind of clear his mind from the immediate trauma that's happening of either being in the claustrophobic situation or just, being in a place where it's completely dark and a bit scary. On page 29, we're with Kojima, who's talking about her little, I don't know what you'd call it. Maybe, I don't know if it counts as a coping mechanism or a tick or something, but her personal habit, yeah, I guess it is a coping mechanism now that I think about what I was going to say, of cutting things with some scissors, right? They notice it around school. They, it's very subtle, but they start noticing things, and they have no source for it, and she's revealing that she's the one that does that. Um, and so the main character asks Kojima, "And cutting things makes you feel normal?" And she responds, "Yeah. Like when I'm cutting things in my head, I keep telling myself, okay, this is normal. And in that moment, everything that's wrong and everything that's good, it kind of vanishes. It's like that. Like normal's coming right out of the scissors." And overall, I like uh, this habit or this coping mechanism she's got, because when you think of something being produced from scissors, you don't really, you know, I shouldn't say my first instinct is not that something is being produced, right? Like something's being reduced or destroyed or something like that. So to me, it kind of lends itself to her mental state of how cutting scissors is normal in a world where normal is, very subjective. Um, and it's pretty harmless, much less than what I've read in other books or what I've experienced or seen in real life. Um, so it's that's pretty interesting to me, and I like that inclusion, and I liked the words that she was saying about, you know, in that moment, everything that's wrong and everything that's good, it kind of vanishes, like. And I think that someone in this situation having maybe a more traditional hobby or a traditional craft or something could find solace in something similar, right? But to a child, maybe that's not something that you really consider, So I really like that part. The next one on page 44 goes a little bit into the darker territory, a little bit of the hopeless vibes, where the main character's talking to Kojima, and I believe they're at the train. Yeah, they're at the train station. She's mindlessly playing with her bag, and she asks the main character something. And this is after a little bit of silence, but she says, "Hey, if we keep doing this, just saying nothing, no matter what they do, think maybe we'll become things too?" Main character doesn't know how to respond. And I believe he responds in a bit of a logical way, saying, "We're not going to turn into flowers or desks, but we'll be acting just like things." So basically, and this is really, this is one of the parts where I mean, it's only 44 pages in, so it's not that far, but I really enjoyed this shift in tone, because while things have been hopeless in the sense that, like, they don't feel like they can get assistance from their parents or from adults, this starts to move into the realm of, like, identity and maybe their self-esteem, in the sense of, like, less surface value, I guess, right? Where it's like, if I don't do anything, if I just continue to accept this bullying, I don't say anything to anybody, I don't do anything to prevent it, like, how different am I from if they were doing this to, like, say, a stuffed animal or something, or a desk? So I really like this. To me, this was one of the shifts in tone. They were on the way. This was I think it was a pretty upbeat moment in the story. They're literally on the way to see the painting that's, titled with the same, that shares a title with the book, Heaven. It's one of her favorite paintings. And so for it to be in this upbeat moment where they're traveling, and it's kind of an adventure, and then it does this shift, it really, it helps set that apart to me. All right, I have two on page 47. The first one, this is where we start to dive deeper into, it's technically about her analysis of this painting, Heaven, which I believe is two lovers eating a cake. And it's part of her analysis of this painting. And she says, "No." Kojima spoke to me in a low voice coming from the back of her throat. "Something really painful happened to them. Something really, really sad. But know what? They made it through. That's why they can live in perfect harmony. After everything, after all the pain, they made it here. It looks like a normal room, but it's really heaven." And I love this. It was a great reminder, or at least a little bit of a, to me it was like a touchstone that there is hope somewhere in these children, right? Or at least Kojima at this point. But there is hope, right? She's saying they made it through these troubling times, and that's why their life is maybe even better, and I thought this was wonderful, especially for a child, if I'm reading this book, to believe that a child concluded that from this image that's described to us as like I said, two lovers eating cake in a room with a red carpet and a table. It's so beautiful. And what's really cool is they can stretch their necks however they want. Wherever they go, whatever they do, nothing ever comes between them. And I'm not certain, maybe I'm forgetting, but I don't think it's described to us in any other meaningful way. So, it's very interesting how she's taken this from that piece of art. So that was really cool. And then the another short one just at the end here, when they're talking about another painting of a horse's face, I believe. Yeah, a horse's face. And she says, "Look at these colors," I said. "They were warm, but not necessarily comforting. A giant face and giant colors." We looked at the painting together. "Look at these eyes," she whispered. "See the white line connecting the horse and the green guy?" Eyes. The instant the word left her lips, I almost had a heart attack. So he effectively gets triggered by the word eyes here, because of his lazy eye. And I'm not sure if I mentioned it before, but assuming you've read the book, his main, reason for being bullied, that you might think is his eyes. So this is his main source of trauma. And for that reason, just her saying the word, "look at these eyes," sends him into a spiral, and he instantly gets kind of knocked out of it. And it skips past it pretty quickly, or it skips past pretty quickly, because I believe Kojima got ran into by another art attendant, but I thought that part was important just to show his reaction to something so mundane. On page 58, he said, "Oh yeah, he's doing some self-inspecting, thinking about himself, and he says, I stood in the mirror and studied my own face. My right eye drifted, watching something it kept to itself. It was disgusting. I leaned into my reflection. No matter how close I got, I couldn't make my eyes meet. My bad eye was like a slimy deep-sea fish from a hidden world, but it was sitting right there, lazy as ever." My favorite part of this is watching something it kept to itself. So he feels, from what I understand, he feels so disconnected because of how his eyes have gotten him treated, how he has no control over it or very little control over it because of its condition, that it kind of feels like it's not a part of himself. It's a deep sea fish from a hidden world. It's got a mind of its own. It's keeping something to itself, not sharing it with him, and I think that's a beautiful representation of how people's physical attributes can kind of reflect on their mental state. Moving on, page 65, we learn that his father, Kojima's father, wasn't much of a talker. We're learning like the reasoning why the relationship didn't work, right? But he would kind of close up when things got heated. It wasn't really arguing, more like yelling. My mom was always calling my dad names, but he never said anything back, or maybe he couldn't. But my mom didn't like that either. Well, I don't know. It's just, it kind of makes arguing hard when the other person doesn't say anything back. And so I think what I gleaned from this is maybe a small one, but what I gleaned from this is this might be, and she doesn't say this, I don't think, but this might be one of the reasons why Kojima is a little bit more brave in the way that she shares and expresses her feelings. Obviously not to an adult or to anybody that can help, but to the main character, or to herself even, right? I think that's important. So I really enjoyed that. Another quick one on page 71. She just literally asked the question, why do you think they do it? Why do you think they treat us like they do? And she goes on to talk about how, what we would all assume pretty quickly is that they're not really thinking, not at all. They're just doing what they've seen other people do, following blindly. They don't know what it means or why they're doing it. You and me, we're just an outlet for them. And then just this first sentence of the next paragraph is, but it isn't meaningless. When it's all over, we'll reach a place, somewhere, or something we could never reach without having gone through everything we've gone through. Know what I mean? And her voice was confident. So this kind of harkens back to the earlier statement about where she starts talking about the painting and how these people are molded by their experiences and this kind of trial by fire so to speak, and how I think this confirms that's what she was talking about earlier, right? Like in my earlier tab that I was reading from, where it's like we could never get here without having gone through this stuff, and so it looks at it kind of in a positive light, right? Um, and I think it's great. I also think it's very troubling, of course, but it's very impressive. Very impressive that she can draw these conclusions when she's going through these things. The next one on page 99, I'll read the paragraph. It says, "I think you're right," she said. "I mean, we're the same age as them. Our bodies are as big as theirs, and if we wanted to, we could push back, give them a taste of their own medicine. We could put up a fight, we could get revenge, but we don't. What's stopping us?" And I won't read anymore, but basically the main character tries to meekly answer that he's too weak to fight back, and rightfully so, Kojima doesn't believe that. So I really like this edition because they're really confronting their choices here. You know, like talking about how they get bullied and how this was right after he's like the large beating that he took in the middle of the gym, I believe. And I think that they're really confronting their actions or their lack of action here. And, I think that's a great addition, because if they were just sitting here talking about how this stuff is happening to them, or maybe why, or wondering how, like just sitting here toiling about it, but they're confronting. They're really saying, like, we're not doing anything about it. We're letting it happen. We know what's going on, and this is back to Kojima's ability to spin things into a positive, and it's saying we see it and we let it happen. I don't think that's weakness at all. It's more like strength. And the main character doesn't quite understand at this point, I don't think, but I think that's another great mark for Kojima in the idea of going through, maybe this flawed idea that going through this bullying is good for them almost. It shows something about them, and it will lead them to a better place, right? Like, which I think might be a little bit of coping, and also, there could be some truth to it, but you definitely wouldn't want people to experience trauma in order to grow. On page 112, the main character is pondering death, to put it simply. He says, "What is dying anyway? I let this impossible question fill the darkness of my bedroom. I thought about how somebody was always dying somewhere at any given moment. This isn't a fable or a joke or an abstract idea. People are always dying. It's a perfect truth. No matter how we live our lives, we all die sooner or later. In which case, living is really just waiting to die. And if that's true, why bother living at all? Why was I even alive?" I'll stop there, but afterwards he has a bit of a revelation that dying is very similar to sleeping. You only know that you've slept after you've woken up. But if morning never comes, you sleep forever. That must be what death is like, he says. And I think it's a pretty apt description. I don't think that it's impossible, with the concepts of lucid dreaming or anything like that to be aware that you're dreaming. I think that a lot of people have experienced this, at least once in their life, maybe more if you're capable of pulling yourself out of a dream like that. And then we can also, kind of not write it off, but we can also counter that with the kind of awake and asleep state people are in depending on their sleep cycle. But I think it's an apt description of the finality, right? The uncontrollable nature of death, right? You only know you're sleeping when you wake up the next day, but if morning never comes, you sleep forever. Like, that must be what death's like. That's what he says, and I think I tend to agree. He says when someone dies, they don't even know they're dead because they never see it happen. Nobody ever really dies. This statement right here is where, admittedly, I was a little lost. Because they never see it happen, nobody ever really dies. This one's tough because, the obvious might be like if someone's slowly dying or something, but then again, there's no memory or there's no recollection or no visual of someone dying, like the experience. So I guess I understand that. But it's a pretty big, now that we're past halfway through the book, he's really confronting death and just trying to understand it. The way he's talking is very troublesome with, living is really just waiting to die, and why bother living at all? Why was I even alive? He's like hyperventilating here, laying in bed. So that's very troublesome it's a very troublesome line of thought. But it's understandable how he got to this. He starts, I think later in this page or the next page, he starts visualizing himself dead and what would happen. How would people react? Who would be there? What would it really affect? And that's a scary road to go down, right? But as these kids are seemingly pushed to the brink, the brink of hopelessness and disappointment over their situation. It's understandable. The next one on page 131, we're in chapter 7 now, and he's recovering from I don't remember if he broke his nose or the bullies broke his nose, but they certainly had their way with it. And he's at the hospital talking to the doctor, and he says, take good care of your nose. I know, I said. I only get one. That's right, he laughed. One is all you get. The doctor told me the pain should go away soon, but that I could always come back if anything came up. When I thanked him and got up to leave, he asked me one more thing. How long has your eye been that way? I looked back, paralyzed. No plans to have that taken care of? Now, the main character has a hard time responding to this. And the doctor goes on to, ask a couple more questions about, doesn't it make things hard? Some people get migraines or they have other problems. And he ends up telling the doctor that he had surgery once, but the eye went back to normal. And the surgery when he was 5. So I think he had given up hope that, and based on the previous, the previous writings, the previous reading of his character, he'd definitely given up hope that this was something he was ever going to overcome, or this was something he was just going to live with for the rest of his life. So that that sentence and I think Kawakami did a great job at making it very casual. You know, the doctor, with his information, the casual nature of how he introduced this, how long's your eye been that way? And the kid like freezes because, this is his whole life, right? His whole life is based on how his eyes have kind of messed up messed up his school situation. So the doctor saying like no plans to have that taken care of. Like he's obviously he's shown some consideration for him, when taking care of him and stuff like that. And just how casual that is so huge. I think that's great. And it definitely, over the next couple pages, and I'll transition this into my next tab, but over the next couple pages, he talks about, oh yeah, but you should be able to do it again, and you should be fine, right? Like, it doesn't cost that much. And this leads to my next one where the main character says, with a simple operation, they could fix my eye. I'd never imagined such a thing was possible. I'd assumed that my failed experience with surgery meant my eye would be this way as long as I lived. My eye could be normal? I couldn't believe it. It was unbelievable. I stood there, unable to suppress the heaving in my chest. He found himself biting his nails too. Couldn't think of what to say, stuff like that. And he's just so clearly rocked by this information. It's a little sad, right? Because he hasn't talked to anybody, so he hasn't figured this information out. But it's also pretty heartwarming. It's this moment where he realizes that the problems in his life might be lessened or reduced in some way. It's great. And I think it was only going to be like $150 or something, some small cost for something that, for this child, these problems were everything. These problems were his whole life, So that was a great moment. It was very, very heartwarming. As much as he was paralyzed and, he hadn't considered it, it was a great moment. The next one on page 138, he has talked about Kojima a little bit. Or he talked to Kojima a little bit, and he says, he says, and she told me that she liked my eyes. Nobody in my entire life had ever told me that. Just Kojima. But after what happened that day in the gym, I hadn't been able to look directly at her. The more Kojima cheered me on, and the more she cultivated that strange power, inexplicable considering how they bullied her, the harder it was to look her in the eye. And then he talks about how comforted he was whenever she talked and she smiled, and he received this positive attention, and so now he's at a loss where this person who's like really helping him get through this is telling him that she liked his eyes. But now he's up against the conundrum of, but the doctor just said I could get my eyes fixed, and soon after he tells her that, soon after in the book at least, he tells her that if he went through surgery, there was a chance his eye could be fixed. And she kind of, it's a big deal, and it transitions into my next tab. It's a big deal to her, I should say. Transition to my next tab where she says, Your eyes are your most important part. They make you who you are. No one else has your eyes. I wasn't born with a sign, so I had to make my own. But your eyes were a gift. Now you want to throw that away? The thing that brings us together? And I like this part because, the further we go on, the more flawed, you can kind of get into, since you can get into these characters' thought processes deeper, the more they talk about it, the more flaws you can spot, right? And this kind of toxic, if this was, this is like kind of a toxic friendship in this moment where she's saying like you're trying to fix something about yourself, but this, I'm not certain personally if it's labeled as a disability, but this unique aspect of your eyes, you're trying to get rid of it. They're a gift. They're your most important, the most important part about you. Like, to me, that's a little unfortunate for something to say. Like, even for someone, like, if you think about a different injury or a different birth defect or something like that, saying that someone who is in a wheelchair, like their legs are their most important part about them, like that, it seems very reductive, and it, presumably puts way more importance on something than that person might want. Like, sure, it, just like every other person, like, it's a part that helps define you, but, or it helps like describe you, but like it doesn't define you, is what I want to say. So that's it's a rough statement to hear, and she's obviously very upset, saying like, I bet you were psyched when you found out. You're gonna do it and run away from the school, run away from yourself and the bullying. And it's just, it's a tough, this little part of the breakup, that they're experiencing. And then, days later, she's getting bullied in school. On my next tab on page 150, she's being bullied in school, and he actually, I don't know if it's for the first time in front of other people. I don't believe so, but I heard myself saying her name, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were blank. She was smiling perfectly at something beyond me. So she had kind of, written him off, right? Like, to her, in my eyes, at least, to her, he's just like everyone else now. He wants to fix this thing that makes him beautiful and that is the most important part, in her words, So that was a small one, but something that I thought was a good addition. And then my next one is on 152, where we're getting into, he's talked about masturbation once or twice now, and I mean, we're reaching the end of the book here, but he's talked about masturbation once or twice now, and this is the section in which he imagined Kojima, or at least used her in a way while masturbating. And he explains as being caught in the undertow. He couldn't make the image of Kojima go away. So for some reason, during his masturbation, she's the one that popped up, even though a moment before he says she did not belong in that world, right? Like she was this maybe sacred friend, or and he explains, this whole scenario that he thinks about, and then says, "The face I saw as the ecstasy abated was full and warm, a little puzzled, but kind and looking at me. This was the Kojima that I wanted. When I finished, the softness and the kindness vanished. Her face grew cold, eyes dead, cheeks sunken. She stared at me and smiled. She said, 'We're friends, right?' She told me she liked my eyes and kept on smiling. It was the smile from the last time I saw her." And this is kind of a combination tab, because this is like right after what I just said, but this this feeling that he's getting, and then right after, most adults understand the mindset change you can undergo after, masturbating or ejaculating in this case. And uh, as soon as that, what is it called? Clarity, the post nut clarity for guys. I don't know if there's a different word for women, but as soon as that hits, like her eyes go back to, the harsh reality that her cheeks are sunken and her eyes are dead. And so I thought it was interesting. I understand, and this is all my personal stuff, but like this entire thing is my personal opinion, but from my perspective, I have a hard time understanding some of this imagery, right? Like and it's kind of common in the two or three other Japanese books that I've read, or at least, the books with Japanese authors, of this like really vivid imagery of the perverse nature, right? So the part that I didn't read, where, right above it, where he's fully describing this, like, this image that he's thinking about while he's masturbating. And at points, he's saying, like, how it's great. At other times, it slips into, her face transforms into the girl he saw some other, not the girl, it's the same girl, but the other face in which she was looking somewhere else, and it's very interesting. And I recognize that for a child, especially his age, this is like a big aspect. So maybe that's my personal hang up, but I thought the imagery of after he was finished and, reality came setting back in, that's obviously very, like I said, very relatable for most people, like your mind, some people describe it as becoming like a different person, right? Like afterwards, it's one of the few times without outside drugs where people's mood or mental entirely change within seconds. And, I can understand that. But of course, after it hits, my next tab on the next page, where he says, I decided I was the worst person on the face of the planet. The grossest. What the hell was I doing? A black hole was opening behind him, right? Like he feels terrible. He feels, He feels awful. He doesn't even clean up. He doesn't, he's just leaning against the wall, feeling like shit. um, and while maybe not related in any way, I can certainly understand how your mindset can change very quickly while doing something like that. And maybe that's the point that I'm not really clicking with, is that for this child, it's hard to differentiate some of these things whenever they're so vivid and so real and so new, right? Like these sexual experiences are new. This like personal exploration, and it's combining with everything they know. It's harder to compartmentalize compared to being an adult and being like, okay, this is a good time, and this is, this is like maybe some of the sadder times in my life, and how to kind of differentiate. So maybe that's the point that I missed initially, the reason I put that tab. We are on our penultimate tab here on page 160, and it says, this is after, this is during like the group bullying session where the girls and the boy bullies kind of got together with these two, our two main characters here, and they kind of worked together to bully both of them. And Ninomiya, the main boy bully, basically said to take Kojima's clothes off, told him to. And then where my tab is, I'll read the paragraph. Thunder rumbled through the light, and rain pattered from the sky. One of the girls complained that she was getting wet. In spite of the rain, the sun was brighter than before. If there were no clouds, where was this rain coming from? It was golden, lit by the color of the sun, spraying down in lines, hitting the back of the whale and the tires and my skin. And I think this is the reason I tabbed it is because I think this is kind of going into his coping mechanism again, right? Like where he has to really pull himself out. He has to, in a way disassociate from the situation, and he's contemplating like weather patterns, he's contemplating like the beauty of the weather and how it's hitting his surroundings. It's something that you might think about if you've ever had to do like an exercise in grounding yourself, whether good or bad, or for the purpose of good probably. But he's saying the rain's falling from the sky and it's hitting the back of the whale and the tires, and it's hitting my skin. Like he's making these things real in his head. In this situation, that this is one of the worst sections of bullying, where they're really just like torturing them and making them do everything. So, as it's in the middle of this terrible situation, but he's like been stripped naked, and he right after this he finally fights back, right? And he thinks about what Momose, the older bully that kind of stays out of it a little bit, right? Like he doesn't necessarily do things himself, but he had a conversation with him at some point in the book in the hospital, and he thinks about that, and he thinks about like it's simple, right? It's a fully functional system. And this is from the next page. If you want to take that rock and bash Ninomiya over the head, then you should do it. Look, he's distracted. If you do it now, he'll be down for the count. Then you can finish the job. You'll feel great. You'll save Kojima. They'll run away. When the others see, they'll run away. Like, he starts thinking about this concept of fighting back really seriously now. But ultimately his body doesn't budge, right? And now that is, oh, this is kind of a small one. My next one on 170, it's after the, or it's before the surgery. And she's saying, I think you should have it done. They're making some tea and stuff. Uh, and he's explaining to her what the doctor said. And he said, or she asked, would you have to stay in the hospital? She asked, taking a seat. They said that at my age, it would be one night at most. What? That's it? She laughed. It feels like it should be a bigger deal than that. More dramatic. Yeah, maybe. I laughed. Mom laughed too. Well, don't worry about the cost, she said with an air of finality. If you're going to do it, you should have the best doctor in the country. And then I won't read it verbatim, but basically goes on to say, he goes on to explain how young doctors apparently do this all the time, and basically anyone can do it, and says it's going to cost 15,000 yen, which I believe is close to, $150, $140 maybe. And she's like, that's all? And it's a small tab, but it's a great moment of the happy reality, right? A couple times in this book, they've gone back to the bleak reality, like they've escaped to some maybe internal or maybe some other place, like some location, external place. But this was one of the few happy realities they kind of reach where it's like, oh, I thought that was going to be, like it adds a little bit of, adds not even a little, it adds a lot of humor to the situation, right? This entire last 170 pages or whatever has been about how his life has been miserable because of this eye thing. And, not only did she not know about this, but the information, after learning this information, it's so nonchalant. It's like, oh, well, thought it was going to be more dramatic than that, but, that's no problem. And then soon after he has the surgery. So I appreciate you if you've listened to all this. I'm sure it wasn't groundbreaking by any means, but I really enjoyed this book. I thought it was very interesting. My only gripes I could really think of is that it was a little too introspective for middle school students, right? It's very difficult to believe that a middle school student could think so thoughtfully about some of these concepts, especially during the traumatic events happening or something like that. So, but that was my only real hang up. And it's very easy to kind of enchant myself with the imagery and the introspection more so, and kind of get past that, especially since these kids have been through things that I certainly haven't gone through, and especially not at that age, so it was very interesting. I really liked it. If you enjoyed it, I would love to hear your thoughts on any of these topics, or whether you think I'm right or wrong, but I appreciate it.